Hi Angels. This is Shadows of Fear by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. After being affected by a villain's fear-inducing quirk, Shouta Aizawa Eraserhead finds himself struggling with a relentless, intangible anxiety that disrupts his life as a teacher and hero. The story follows Aizawa's journey as he confronts this deep-seated fear, learning to accept vulnerability and lean on those he trusts, particularly his partner, Hizashi Yamada present Mike. With Yamada's unwavering support, Aizawa gradually discovers that true strength isn't about being unbreakable, it's about resilience and the courage to keep moving forward, even when afraid. In the end, Aizawa finds peace, learning to coexist with his fear rather than letting it control him. This journey not only restores his confidence, but also deepens his understanding of what it truly means to be a hero. Chapter 1: The Encounter. Aizawa's breath turned to mist in the cool night air, and the usual silence of the city was thick with an uncharacteristic weight. Patrols like these were often uneventful, a quiet, fog-filled night with little action. Normally, he welcomed the stillness. Tonight, though, there was something strange hanging in the air, a sense of disquiet that pressed down on him. He moved soundlessly through the shadows, the city lights dimmed by the dense fog rolling over the streets. He'd done countless patrols, walked through alleys and shadows with nothing but his capture weapon and the quiet rhythm of his steps to keep him company. But tonight, he felt a tug at the back of his mind, something telling him that something was off. Ahead, a faint sound drifted through the mist, a shuffle of footsteps. Aizawa's gaze snapped to the source, his instincts sharpening. He edged closer, his capture weapon coiled and ready, blending into the dim surroundings. Rounding a corner, he spotted the figure, a person leaning against the alley wall, barely visible in the thick fog. They wore a dark hood pulled low, obscuring their face, but their stance held a strange calm, almost as if they were waiting. Aizawa's guard went up. "You," he called out, his voice a low command. "Step out into the light. Hands where I can see them." The figure didn't flinch. Instead, they lifted their heads slightly, just enough for Aizawa to catch a glint of their eyes beneath the hood, a dark gleam that sent an unexplainable chill down his spine. "Funny thing about heroes," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. "They don't know fear until it stares them right in the face." The tone was taunting, almost casual, but Aizawa wasn't one to be rattled by empty threats. He narrowed his eyes, activating his quirk to disable any abilities the stranger might have. He felt his eyes heat up, the familiar red glow piercing through the fog as he prepared to immobilize the potential threat. But the stranger didn't react, didn't so much as blink. Instead, they took a single, deliberate step forward, an eerie smile creeping across their face. "Let's see what hides in the dark, Eraserhead." In an instant, they lunged, reaching out. Aizawa instinctively moved back, aiming to dodge, but he felt a brief, cold touch brush against his forearm, a fleeting contact, but enough to send a shiver through him. His heart rate spiked as a chilling sensation spread from the point of contact, a strange numbness seeping into his skin and spreading rapidly. He staggered back, the world around him dimming for a split second, his vision blurring as a disorienting wave of unease washed over him. Every shadow seemed to deepen, stretching toward him with a life of its own. His mind raced, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt the unmistakable prick of fear. "What did you do?" His voice came out harsher than he intended, barely masking the unfamiliar panic creeping into his tone. The stranger chuckled, their laughter low and unsettling, echoing faintly off the alley walls. "Just a little taste of fear," they replied, backing away as they disappeared further into the fog. "Consider it a gift. Let's see how you handle it." Aizawa blinked, and just like that, the figure was gone, swallowed by the mist as if they had never been there. He stood there, frozen, trying to shake off the strange feeling clinging to his skin. His heart continued to pound in his chest, refusing to slow down, the fear growing stronger instead of fading. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to push down the panic that bubbled beneath the surface. He turned away, his feet feeling strangely unsteady as he made his way back to the street. Every corner, every darkened shadow, seemed sharper, more menacing than before. He scanned the area, half expecting to see the figure lurking nearby, but the alley was empty. Just him and the fog, with the faint sounds of the city echoing distantly in the background. Aizawa pressed a hand to his chest, willing himself to calm down. His instincts told him that the villain had planted more than just words in his mind. The fear gnawed at him, irrational and raw, twisting his usually steely composure into something unrecognizable. He needed to report back, to let someone know what had happened, but his voice felt strangled, his mind clouded with doubts. He knew one thing for certain, he couldn't face this alone. Forcing his legs to move, he stumbled down the street, heading back toward the one place he knew he could find a sliver of solace, home. The thought of Yamada waiting for him steadied him just enough to keep moving, even as the shadows around him seemed to whisper threats in his ears. The familiar streets seemed foreign tonight, shadows stretching longer, lights dimmer. Each step home was weighed down by an inexplicable tension that clung to Aizawa like a second skin. He knew that every shadow he passed was just that, a shadow. And yet, every nerve in his body screamed otherwise. By the time he reached his front door, his hands were shaking, an odd sight against his usual calm. Aizawa took a slow, deliberate breath and turned the key, pushing the door open as quietly as possible. It should have been a comforting sound, that gentle creak of the door, but tonight it made him flinch, his pulse quickening at the noise. His eyes darted around the room as he closed the door behind him, searching for anything out of place, even though he knew logically that everything would be as he left it. "Shouta?" Yamada's voice floated from the kitchen, warm and familiar, but even that didn't ease the tension coiled within Aizawa. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself, as Yamada appeared in the doorway with an easy smile that quickly turned into a look of concern when he saw Aizawa's face. "Hey. Are you okay?" Aizawa tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, stuck behind the feeling of dread still clawing at his insides. He'd handled countless threats, faced villains with unimaginable abilities, yet none of it had ever left him feeling like this, like a raw nerve, exposed and vulnerable. He started, voice rougher than he intended, each syllable feeling heavy on his tongue. There was a villain tonight. They had a quirk that, he trailed off, the words slipping away as he struggled to describe the creeping fear lodged deep within him. Yamada's brow furrowed with worry as he took a step closer, his hand coming to rest on Aizawa's shoulder. "What kind of quirk?" His voice was gentle, understanding, but the question lingered, and Aizawa felt a shiver run down his spine as he recalled the villain's words. "Fear," he managed, the single word leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "They said, they'd show me what it feels like to be afraid." Even saying it aloud felt strange, as though voicing the fear somehow made it more real. Yamada's expression softened, the concern in his eyes intensifying as he looked at Aizawa. "Come on, let's sit down. You look like you could use a break." He guided Aizawa over to the couch, his hand never leaving Aizawa's shoulder, grounding him in the present. Aizawa allowed himself to sink into the cushions, the weight of his body suddenly feeling heavier, as if gravity itself had intensified. Yamada settled beside him, his hand moving to gently hold Aizawa's. "Shouta, I know it's not easy for you to talk about these things, but I'm here. Just tell me what happened. Maybe it'll help." Aizawa looked down at their entwined hands, focusing on the warmth of Yamada's touch, a steady reminder that he wasn't alone in this. But even that warmth couldn't completely erase the cold that seemed to seep from his bones. "It's hard to explain," he began, voice quiet. "When they touched me, it was like something inside me froze. Like every shadow became a threat, and every sound was amplified. I couldn't shake it off." He swallowed, trying to push back the memory of the villain's mocking words, that grin etched into his mind. "It's irrational, I know. But it feels real. Like there's something lurking just beyond my sight." Yamada's hand tightened around his, a silent gesture of support. Fear isn't always rational, Shouta. And you don't have to fight this on your own. I'm here to help you through it, whatever it takes. Aizawa glanced up, meeting Yamada's gaze, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of something other than fear, gratitude, maybe, or perhaps relief. He hadn't even realized how tightly he'd been holding himself together until he felt that small crack in his defenses. Thank you, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't used to needing help, much less asking for it. But here, in the quiet of their home, he allowed himself to lean into Yamada's presence, to let go, just a little. Yamada's thumb traced soothing circles over his hand. How about some tea, he offered, voice light, as if he were suggesting something as mundane as a late-night snack. It was a small gesture, but Aizawa nodded, the simple offer oddly comforting. While Yamada moved to the kitchen, Aizawa leaned back, closing his eyes. He focused on the sounds around him, the soft clinking of cups, the gentle hum of the kettle warming up. Each sound was familiar, grounding him, reminding him that he was safe, that he was home. But as he sat there, the shadows seemed to deepen, stretching across the walls in strange patterns. He forced himself to breathe slowly, but with each breath, the dread crept back in, sharper and more persistent than before. His heart began to pound again, the irrational thoughts flooding his mind once more. What if the villain's Quirk had left something behind? What if there was something hiding here, lurking in the dark corners of his mind, something he couldn't escape? A faint clink pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. He opened his eyes to see Yamada standing in front of him, holding a cup of steaming tea. Yamada offered him a reassuring smile, and Aizawa took the cup, the warmth seeping into his hands as he wrapped his fingers around it. Here, Yamada said, sitting beside him again. Sip slowly, and breathe. You're here, with me. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're seeing. I'm right here. Aizawa took a slow sip, the warmth of the tea spreading through him, battling the cold gnawing at his insides. Yamada's steady presence beside him, the quiet strength in his voice, slowly pulled Aizawa back from the edge, grounding him in the moment. For the first time since the encounter, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this fear alone. The shadows were still there, lingering at the edges of his vision, but with Yamada beside him, they seemed a little less daunting. And perhaps, that was enough. Chapter 2, Living Nightmares. Aizawa woke up with a start, his breath caught in his throat as his eyes snapped open. The room was dark, but his senses were sharp, as though he were still patrolling, still on edge, waiting for an unseen threat to leap out from the shadows. He glanced around, heart pounding, the edges of the room blurring and shifting in his vision. It took him a moment to remember where he was. Home. He was safe. Yamada's even breathing beside him grounded him, a soft, steady rhythm that he tried to match with his own breaths. But the fear still lingered, curling at the edges of his mind, like the shadows in his dreams that had refused to let him rest. Careful not to wake Yamada, Aizawa sat up, running a hand through his tangled hair. The dreams had been relentless. Flickers of the villain's face, that mocking smile, the chill of the touch that had spread like frost through his veins, all of it returned every time he closed his eyes. Shouta? Yamada's sleepy voice broke through his thoughts. Aizawa looked down, meeting his husband's concerned gaze. Sorry. Didn't mean to wake you. Yamada shifted to sit up, stifling a yawn as he leaned against the headboard. You're still dealing with whatever that villain did, aren't you? There was no judgment in his voice, only worry, softened by the tenderness that Yamada always seemed to bring with him, even in the middle of the night. Aizawa hesitated, then gave a slight nod. It's hard to explain. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He'd faced so many threats, handled dangers that would make most heroes falter, yet this villain, with nothing more than a touch and a few words, had left him feeling vulnerable in a way he couldn't shake. Yamada's hand found his, fingers interlacing, a quiet gesture that offered strength, without demanding anything in return. You don't have to explain, Shouta. I know you don't like talking about this kind of thing, but I'm here to listen whenever you're ready. No pressure. Aizawa looked away, a small sigh escaping him. I thought it was just, in my head. But these dreams, these feelings, they're too real. I can't just brush them off. Yamada squeezed his hand, pulling him a bit closer. Maybe there's more to that villain's quirk than we thought. Quirks that mess with the mind can have lingering effects, especially ones that induce fear. But hey, if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you're stronger than whatever this quirk is trying to make you believe. Aizawa wanted to believe that, too, but every time he thought he had a grasp on himself, the fear crept back in, insidious and relentless. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the past night's dreams pressing down on him. I don't know if it's that simple. I'm usually the one who keeps others steady, but now, he trailed off, the unspoken admission hanging heavily between them. Yamada's gaze softened, and he reached up to gently cup Aizawa's cheek. You don't have to carry this on your own, Shouta. Not with me here. Let's try taking it one step at a time, yeah? And if that means dealing with these fears together, then that's what we'll do. The warmth of Yamada's touch was a comfort Aizawa couldn't bring himself to pull away from. He allowed himself a moment to lean into it, closing his eyes and focusing on the calm presence beside him. Thanks, Hizashi. I appreciate it. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the room bathed in the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds. It was a quiet, fragile peace, but one that Aizawa held on to, however fleeting it might be. When Yamada finally shifted to lie back down, Aizawa felt a pang of guilt for keeping him up, but Yamada simply waved it off with a reassuring smile. Try to get some sleep, Shouta, Yamada murmured, his voice a soothing lull. I'll be right here if you need me. Aizawa settled back beside him, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to sink into the quiet darkness, Yamada's hand resting on his own. This time, when he drifted off, the dreams were softer, and the shadows less menacing. Morning came too quickly, the sunlight streaming through the window pulling Aizawa from his restless sleep. He felt as though he'd barely slept, his body heavy with exhaustion as he pushed himself up. Yamada was already up, probably in the kitchen making breakfast, as he often did when he knew Aizawa needed a bit of extra support. Aizawa moved slowly, each step weighed down by the fatigue that had yet to loosen its grip on him. He made his way to the kitchen, where Yamada greeted him with a bright smile, a plate of toast and eggs already set on the table. Morning, sunshine, Yamada greeted him, the nickname tugging a reluctant smile from Aizawa. Morning, Aizawa mumbled, his voice rough from sleep. He sat down, picking up a piece of toast and taking a small bite, though he hardly tasted it. His mind still lingered on the night's dreams, the fear twisting beneath the surface. Yamada sat across from him, watching him with that steady, unwavering gaze. How are you feeling today? Aizawa hesitated, then shrugged. A bit better, maybe. The dreams were less intense. It was true, though the fear still lingered, muted but persistent. Yamada's face lit up, a small victory in his eyes. That's a step forward. We'll take it one step at a time, remember? He reached across the table, resting his hand on Aizawa's. And if you need anything, even if it's just a distraction, let me know. We're in this together. Aizawa nodded, a sense of calm settling over him as he looked down at their hands, intertwined once more. He didn't know how long the effects of the villain's quirk would last, but with Yamada by his side, the weight felt just a little bit lighter. As they finished breakfast, Aizawa couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface, a darkness that refused to let go. But today, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't going to let fear control him, not with Yamada there to help him face it. And as they prepared for the day, Aizawa found himself holding on to that fragile glimmer of hope, a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. The day went on quietly, but the sensation of lurking dread was relentless, a constant hum at the back of Aizawa's mind. As he made his way through Yue's hallways, his senses felt sharper, as though tuned to every tiny movement, every echoing sound in the vast corridors. His instincts were usually a source of strength, a finely tuned instrument honed over years of hero work. But now, it felt as though they'd turned against him, magnifying every minor shift in the environment until he felt surrounded by invisible threats. As he entered the classroom, his students greeted him with the usual energy, a mix of respect and camaraderie that he'd come to appreciate. Usually, he could ground himself in his work, finding solace in the steady rhythms of teaching and training, but today, he felt that familiar tension coil tighter within him. He barely noticed as the students settled down, his mind drifting back to the villain's face, to the mocking smile and chilling touch that seemed burned into his memory. He fought to push the image away, but it was like trying to hold back a tide. "Sensei?" Aizawa snapped back to the present, his gaze focusing on Midoriya, who looked at him with wide, curious eyes. Are you all right?" Midoriya asked hesitantly. The rest of the class turned, their collective attention shifting to him, concern beginning to ripple through the room. Aizawa straightened, pulling his expression into one of neutrality. "I'm fine, Midoriya. Let's get started." He moved through the lesson, focusing on technical aspects of combat and strategy, keeping his explanations brief and to the point. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, searching for something he couldn't name. He could feel the students watching him, their concern palpable, but he forced himself to press on, unwilling to let the fear dictate his actions. When the class finally ended, Aizawa dismissed the students, his voice strained. He watched as they filed out, some of them glancing back at him with uncertain expressions. Normally, he'd check in with a few of them, make sure they were staying on track, but today, he just wanted to be alone. Once the last student left, Aizawa sank into his chair, exhaling slowly as he closed his eyes. His heartbeat, steady moments ago, began to pound again as the quiet enveloped him. He could almost feel the weight of the shadows closing in, pressing against him, suffocating in their silence. He clenched his fists, trying to ground himself, but the fear tightened its hold, his body rigid as his mind spiraled back to that night. He could still hear the villain's words, the taunt that had embedded itself in his thoughts, "Let's see what hides in the dark." The door creaked open, and Aizawa flinched, his hand moving instinctively to his capture weapon. But it was only Yamada, who stood in the doorway with a worried look. He stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him before crossing the room to stand beside Aizawa. "Shouta. You look like you've just seen a ghost," Yamada murmured, his voice a gentle anchor in the storm of Aizawa's thoughts. Aizawa let out a shaky breath, his body finally relaxing slightly as he met Yamada's gaze. "It's harder to shake than I thought." The admission felt heavy, but somehow, saying it out loud made it feel a bit more manageable. Yamada placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his expression filled with quiet resolve. "Let's get some fresh air," he suggested softly. "You're cooped up in here, and I think a change of scenery might help clear your mind." Aizawa hesitated but found himself nodding. The idea of leaving the enclosed space of the classroom was oddly appealing. Together, they made their way outside, walking side by side through UA's training grounds, a comforting silence settling between them. The cool breeze was refreshing, a contrast to the stifling atmosphere that had haunted him all day. Aizawa took a slow, steady breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, grounding him in the present moment. Yamada remained beside him, his presence a steadying force, one that reminded Aizawa he didn't have to face this alone. After a while, Yamada spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "I know this is a lot. I can see how much it's affecting you, and I want you to know that whatever you're going through, I'm here for you. Even if it means standing with you in silence, I'll do that. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Aizawa felt a pang of gratitude. It was rare for him to lean on anyone, to open up in this way, but Yamada had a way of breaking down his walls, of finding the cracks in his defenses and filling them with a quiet strength. I can't explain it, Aizawa finally said, his voice low. It's like, I know it's irrational, but every shadow, every sound, they all feel like threats. I keep telling myself it's not real, but it doesn't stop. Yamada nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon as they walked. Fear doesn't always listen to reason. That's why it's so powerful, it gets to you on a level that logic can't always reach. He looked over at Aizawa, his eyes filled with understanding. But just because it feels overwhelming now, doesn't mean it'll last forever. We'll work through it, one day at a time. Aizawa gave a small nod, his mind beginning to settle, the quiet reassurance in Yamada's words calming the fear, if only slightly. They walked in silence for a while longer, the campus stretching out before them in a peaceful stillness that soothed the chaos within. As they neared a small grove of trees, Yamada reached out, gently tugging Aizawa to a halt. He turned to face him, his hands resting on Aizawa's shoulders. Listen to me, Shouta, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Whatever this fear is trying to convince you of, remember that you are stronger than it. You've faced worse, and you've come out on top every time. This is just another challenge. Aizawa looked at him, the weight of the fear loosening just a bit as Yamada's words sank in. He took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in his chest ease slightly. You're right, he murmured, the words feeling like a tentative step forward. Yamada's face softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Of course I am. You're my rock, Shouta, but even rocks need a little support sometimes. And that's what I'm here for. Aizawa managed a faint smile, a warmth spreading through him that felt stronger than the fear, a reminder that he wasn't alone. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Yamada by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could overcome it. Together, they stood there, the wind rustling through the trees, a moment of quiet strength shared between them. And for the first time since the encounter with the villain, Aizawa allowed himself to believe that he could face the shadows, that with Yamada's support, he could find his way back to himself. Chapter 3, Fractured Control. Days slipped by, but the fear clung stubbornly to Aizawa's thoughts, a dark presence he couldn't shake. Mornings at UA were heavy, each step down the familiar hallways tinged with a new edge of tension. His students noticed, their usual banter softened, replaced with sidelong glances that mirrored his own unease. This afternoon, as he observed the students sparring in the training field, he felt the now familiar tightness in his chest. The sharp sounds of combat, the movements and flashes, all of it seemed more intense, like a needle pricking his senses over and over. Usually, his focus would be steady, but now, the control he relied on was slipping, his mind drifting back to that encounter with the villain. Each strike, each movement before him seemed edged with something darker, and the fear wound itself into his chest. Sensei? Aizawa blinked, pulled out of his haze, by Todoroki's voice. He turned to see the young hero's serious gaze, concern lurking behind his usual calm. Are you all right? Todoroki asked, his tone respectful, but carrying an unusual worry. Aizawa realized he'd been gripping his capture weapon tightly, his fingers tense around the familiar cloth. He cleared his throat. I'm fine, Todoroki. Get back to training. He released his hold, trying to will himself back to normal. Todoroki studied him for a moment before nodding, returning to his sparring match. Aizawa took a deep breath, hoping to force his heart back into its regular rhythm, but the unease lingered, simmering beneath the surface. The students wrapped up the session, and as they began to disperse, Aizawa noticed a figure approaching him from the side of the field. Aizawa. He recognized Yamada's voice immediately, turning to find his partner's concerned face. Yamada stepped closer, a hand resting on his shoulder. The warm, steady touch broke through Aizawa's tension, grounding him in the present. How are you holding up? Yamada asked, his voice soft, just loud enough for Aizawa to hear over the fading noise of the students. Aizawa hesitated, but something in Yamada's gaze made it hard to deflect. I'm dealing with it, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. But this isn't something I can just shake off. Everything seems different. He frowned, the frustration seeping into his words. It feels irrational, but it won't go away. Yamada squeezed his shoulder, his eyes steady. It's okay, Shouta. Fear has a way of twisting reality, making even the smallest things feel like threats. And you don't have to do this on your own. I'm here, and you don't have to carry this by yourself. Aizawa took a slow, measured breath, the truth of Yamada's words settling over him. His instinct had always been to handle things alone, to bear the weight without help. But now, with Yamada's quiet support, the heaviness didn't feel quite as suffocating. He offered a brief nod. Thank you, he murmured, allowing himself a rare moment of vulnerability. Yamada's hand stayed on his shoulder, his expression softening. That's what I'm here for. Let's tackle this one step at a time. Aizawa felt a flicker of relief, the fear loosening its grip, if only slightly. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the students leave. But as Aizawa turned to follow Yamada, a flash of movement caught his eye, something dark slipping out of view at the edge of the training grounds. His breath hitched, his instincts kicking in as he searched the shadows. What is it? Yamada asked, his tone instantly alert. Aizawa blinked, realizing there was nothing there. Just a trick of the light, he told himself, though the chill in his veins lingered. Nothing. Must have been my imagination. Yamada regarded him for a moment, then gave his shoulder a reassuring pat. We'll get through this. One shadow at a time. Aizawa managed a small smile, grateful for the understanding in Yamada's voice. Though the fear remained, he felt steadier, reminded that he didn't have to walk through this alone. As they left the training grounds together, he held on to that thought, letting it fortify him against the darkness still lurking just beyond sight. That evening, Aizawa returned home, hoping the familiar comfort would help settle his mind. Yet, as he closed the door behind him, the silence pressed down, amplifying every creak and sigh of the house. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners, shifting with every flicker of light, tugging at the edges of his vision. In the kitchen, Yamada hummed softly to himself, the sound drifting through the rooms with an easy warmth. Aizawa let the melody wash over him, grounding him as he made his way to the table where Yamada had set out 2 steaming bowls of soup. The simplicity of it, home, warmth, Yamada's presence, offered him a brief reprieve from the anxious tension coiled inside him. You're just in time, Yamada said with a smile, setting down a pitcher of water. Thought some hot soup might help shake off the day. Aizawa slid into his seat, nodding in appreciation. Thanks. Smells good. He picked up his spoon, taking a tentative sip, the warmth spreading through him, easing the tightness in his chest. For a few moments, they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the soft clinks of spoons against bowls and the distant hum of the city outside. Aizawa allowed himself to relax, focusing on the simple comfort of the meal, Yamada's reassuring presence beside him. But as they finished eating, the silence grew heavier, a weight settling between them. Yamada cleared his throat, glancing at Aizawa with that familiar look of quiet concern. You know, Yamada began, his voice gentle. We could try some grounding exercises. Sometimes it helps to talk about what's weighing you down, or even to put things into perspective together. It doesn't have to be anything heavy, just whatever comes to mind. Aizawa looked down at his empty bowl, considering the suggestion. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to insist he could handle this alone, but another part, a smaller, quieter part, knew that Yamada was right. The fear was too deep, too insidious to face alone, and perhaps, sharing the burden could help ease its grip. All right, Aizawa replied finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He set his spoon down, glancing at Yamada. But I'm not sure where to start. It's hard to explain. Yamada nodded, his gaze encouraging. That's okay. Let's start with something simple. Describe the feeling, if you can. Not what caused it, but just how it feels. Aizawa took a slow breath, letting the words come unfiltered. It feels like something's always watching, waiting. Even when I know there's nothing there, I can't shake the feeling. Every shadow, every sound, it all feels magnified, as if there's a threat lurking just beyond my sight. Yamada listened quietly, his expression soft and understanding. He reached across the table, resting his hand over Aizawa's. That sounds exhausting, Shouta. It's no wonder you're feeling worn down. But remember, fear isn't truth, it's just a reaction, something temporary. It can feel all-consuming, but it doesn't define you. Aizawa's gaze dropped to their hands, Yamada's warmth a steady presence against his own tension. I know it's not real, he murmured. But knowing it doesn't stop the feeling. That's okay. Fear doesn't just vanish because we understand it, Yamada replied gently. But we can find ways to manage it. Remember, every time you face it, it loses a little more power. Aizawa absorbed Yamada's words, letting them settle over him like a bomb. He'd faced countless threats, had been in situations where he'd come inches from disaster, yet he'd always managed to stay calm, grounded. But this fear was different, it was intangible, a shadow that slipped through his defenses, undermining his confidence in a way he'd never experienced before. It's strange, Aizawa admitted. I'm used to being in control, to handling threats head-on. But this? I can't fight it the way I'd fight a villain. Yamada gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. No, you can't fight it like a villain. But maybe that's the point. Maybe this isn't something you have to defeat, but something you have to face, with help. His voice softened, his gaze holding Aizawa's. And I'm right here, Shouta. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here. Aizawa felt a pang of gratitude, the weight on his chest easing just a little. He let out a slow breath, nodding. Thank you, Hizashi. I don't know what I'd do without you. They sat in silence, the words between them settling, filling the space with a quiet strength that Aizawa held on to. Yamada's hand stayed on his, a grounding presence that reminded him he wasn't alone in this battle. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but with Yamada beside him, it felt a little less overwhelming, a little less powerful. Eventually, Yamada rose, clearing their dishes, and Aizawa followed him to the sink, falling into the rhythm of their shared routine. The mundane tasks, the quiet companionship, all served as anchors, holding him in the present, away from the shadows that waited at the edges of his thoughts. As they finished, Yamada turned to him with a soft smile. How about a walk before bed? Some fresh air might help clear your mind. Aizawa hesitated, then nodded, the idea strangely appealing. Together, they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around them. The street was quiet, the city lights casting soft, golden glows that illuminated their path. They walked in comfortable silence, Aizawa taking in the sights and sounds, letting each step ground him further. As they walked, Yamada glanced over, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've seen you handle so much with this calm, unshakable strength. But even the strongest need rest, Shouta. Sometimes, it's okay to let yourself lean on someone else. Aizawa felt the words sink in, a gentle reminder that he didn't always have to carry everything alone. He looked at Yamada, his voice soft. It's not easy for me, to let go. I know, Yamada replied, his tone understanding. But you don't have to do it all at once. Just one small step at a time. And I'll be right here, every step. Aizawa gave a faint smile, a glimmer of peace settling over him. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but with Yamada beside him, he felt a renewed sense of strength, a quiet resolve to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As they reached the end of the block, Aizawa took a deep breath, the crisp night air filling his lungs. The shadows seemed a little less menacing now, the darkness softened by the warmth of Yamada's presence. And for the first time in days, Aizawa felt a flicker of hope that he could face the fear and find his way back to himself, no matter how long it took. Chapter 4, Steps in the Shadows. The days blended together, a slow, steady rhythm of teaching, training, and quiet evenings at home. The fear lingered, a constant presence Aizawa had yet to fully shake, but with Yamada's patience and support, he was learning to live with it. Each day was a battle that seemed less about defeating the fear and more about learning to carry it without letting it control him. This morning, Aizawa arrived at UA feeling a fragile calm, something he'd come to appreciate as a victory in its own way. He took in the quiet hum of the school as students milled about, their energy filling the halls. Though he couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge, he took a grounding breath, reminding himself he was safe here. But as he prepared to enter the classroom, he noticed a familiar figure waiting for him by the door. Yamada stood there, leaning casually against the wall, a warm smile on his face. "Morning, Shouta," he greeted, his tone light. "Thought I'd catch you before class. How are you feeling?" Aizawa gave a small nod, the tension in his shoulders loosening just a bit at Yamada's presence. "Better, I think. Still, not quite myself, but it's getting easier." Yamada's smile softened, his gaze encouraging. "That's progress. And we'll take progress, no matter how slow." Aizawa managed a faint smile in return. Yamada's optimism was a steadying force, a quiet encouragement that had helped him more than he could express. He didn't feel whole yet, but with Yamada's support, he was learning that he didn't have to face this alone. Before Aizawa could respond, a group of students walked by, their curious glances darting between him and Yamada. With a quick nod, Aizawa gestured toward the classroom. "I should get started." "Of course," Yamada replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "But remember, I'm just a hallway away if you need anything." Aizawa nodded, heading into the classroom with a renewed sense of calm. His students were already settling into their seats, their chatter filling the room with a comforting energy. He took his place at the front of the class, the familiar role bringing a sense of purpose that momentarily drowned out the lingering fear. "All right, let's begin," he announced, his tone steady. "Today, we're going to work on refining your situational awareness. Recognizing subtle cues in your environment can make all the difference in a mission." As he spoke, he scanned the room, watching the students' reactions, their attentiveness, the way they absorbed his words. For a moment, he felt like himself again, grounded in his work, focused on guiding his students. It was a small reprieve, but he clung to it, letting the routine bring him back to solid ground. But just as he was about to start a demonstration, he felt a sudden prickling at the back of his neck. The room seemed to shift, the familiar faces of his students blurring at the edges. He took a steadying breath, trying to shake off the sensation, but it only grew stronger, a creeping unease settling over him. "Sensei?" Midoriya's voice broke through, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Is everything all right?" Aizawa blinked, the fog lifting slightly as he refocused on the classroom. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Let's continue." He tried to push forward, but the unease lingered, wrapping around him like a shadow. He couldn't afford to let his fear show, not here, not in front of his students. But his chest felt tight, his heartbeat unsteady, each breath a struggle to keep the fear from consuming him. As the lesson continued, Aizawa focused on the rhythm of teaching, letting it anchor him. He guided the students through drills, his instructions clear and concise, his mind fighting to stay in the moment. But every now and then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision would jolt him, his nerves on high alert. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Aizawa dismissed the students, his voice clipped as he avoided their curious glances. He could feel their concern, their confusion, but he couldn't bear to let them see the fear still gripping him. As the last student filed out, he slumped into his chair, the mask of control slipping as he exhaled a shaky breath. His hands trembled slightly, a reminder of the vulnerability he'd tried so hard to hide. The fear was relentless, a shadow that clung to him, refusing to let go. A knock at the door startled him, and he looked up to see Yamada standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of empathy and resolve. "Thought you might need a breather," Yamada said, stepping inside. "How was class?" Aizawa let out a weary sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. At least, as fine as it could be. I'm trying to keep it together, but this fear, it's always there, like it's waiting for me to slip." Yamada crossed the room, sitting across from him. "Shouta, you've been doing incredibly well, even if it doesn't feel like it. Fear doesn't just disappear, it takes time to heal. But you're here, you're showing up, and that's no small thing." Aizawa looked away, his jaw tight. "It doesn't feel like enough. I can't even get through a class without feeling like something's going to happen." Yamada leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You're fighting this every day, and that's a strength, Shouta. Just because the fear doesn't vanish overnight doesn't mean you're not making progress. And you're not alone in this, remember?" Aizawa met Yamada's gaze, the words resonating in the quiet. Yamada's presence was a lifeline, a reminder that he didn't have to face this alone, no matter how daunting it felt. "Thanks, Hizashi," he said softly, the gratitude clear in his voice. "I don't think I could do this without you." Yamada's face softened, his eyes warm. "You don't have to do it alone, Shouta. That's the whole point." They sat in silence, the unspoken understanding settling between them, a shared strength that fortified Aizawa's resolve. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but with Yamada's support, it felt a little less insurmountable. After a few moments, Yamada stood, offering Aizawa a small, encouraging smile. "How about a cup of tea? Maybe a few minutes away from the classroom will help." Aizawa nodded, accepting the offer as they left the room together. The hallway was quiet, the echo of their footsteps a steady rhythm that eased the tension in his chest. As they walked side by side, Aizawa felt a renewed sense of strength, a reminder that while the shadows remained, he had someone beside him, someone who would face the darkness with him, no matter how long it took. Aizawa followed Yamada down the quiet hallway, their footsteps the only sound as they moved toward the teacher's lounge. The walk, though brief, helped him find his balance, Yamada's presence acting as a steady force that drew him back from the edges of his anxiety. By the time they entered the lounge, Aizawa felt a fraction more grounded, a sliver of calm settling over him. Yamada moved toward the tea station, grabbing 2 mugs as he filled the kettle with water. Aizawa sat down on the couch, his gaze drifting around the room, noting the little details that often went unnoticed, the stack of neatly folded blankets in the corner, the faint scent of lavender from a diffuser someone must have left on. Small comforts, he realized, reminders of the normalcy he was fighting to hold on to. "So," Yamada said, his voice casual as he prepared the tea, "you've been handling everything well. But I know this isn't easy. Sometimes, it helps to talk through it, even if it's just to unload a bit." Aizawa sighed, resting his head against the back of the couch. "It's complicated. This isn't something I can fight, like an enemy. It's everywhere I look, and it's like it knows how to find me where I'm weakest. Every day, it feels like I'm dragging it around, no matter what I do." Yamada nodded, his gaze sympathetic as he poured the tea. He brought over the 2 mugs, setting one in front of Aizawa, before taking a seat beside him. "Fear is tricky like that. It's sneaky, finds its way into cracks, and makes itself comfortable. But it doesn't mean it's stronger than you, Shouta. It just means it's persistent. And so are you." Aizawa took a slow sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through him. Yamada's words sank in, a comforting reminder of the resilience he'd built over years of hero work. "I want to believe that," he admitted quietly. "But this kind of fear, it's different. It feels more personal." Yamada's face softened, understanding flickering in his eyes. Personal fears are the hardest to face, because they touch parts of us we usually keep hidden, even from ourselves. But you don't have to face it alone. If it helps, I can be right here with you, facing it together. Aizawa looked down at his tea, his grip tightening slightly around the mug. I don't want you to have to deal with this. You didn't sign up for. Shouta, Yamada interrupted gently, his hand resting on Aizawa's arm. I signed up for all of it. I signed up for you. And that includes the hard parts, even the ones you'd rather hide. I'm here because I want to be, because you're not just my partner in name, you're my partner in everything. Aizawa's throat tightened, a rare surge of emotion rising to the surface. He rarely let himself feel so vulnerable, even around those he trusted most, but Yamada's unwavering support, his refusal to let Aizawa face this alone, chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself. Thank you, he said, the words barely audible. He looked up, meeting Yamada's gaze, and found a warmth there that soothed the fear, if only for a moment. I don't know how I'd get through this without you. Yamada gave a small, reassuring smile. You don't have to. I'll be here every step of the way. They sat in silence, sipping their tea, the comfort of Yamada's presence a balm to Aizawa's frayed nerves. The fear still lurked in the background, but with Yamada beside him, it felt more manageable, more distant. After a while, Yamada leaned back, stretching his arms above his head. You know, sometimes distractions can be a good thing. Why don't we head outside? Get a change of scenery? Aizawa hesitated, glancing out the window. The campus grounds were calm, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. Normally, he'd decline, preferring the familiarity of his routines, but something about Yamada's suggestion felt right. Maybe fresh air and a change of perspective were exactly what he needed. All right, he agreed, setting his empty mug down. Let's go. They walked together out to the grounds, the breeze cool and refreshing as it rustled through the trees. Aizawa took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, the familiar surroundings of UA a reminder of the life he'd built here, the purpose that had carried him through countless challenges. Yamada glanced over at him, a thoughtful expression on his face. What if you tried reframing the fear, he asked, his voice calm. Instead of seeing it as a weakness, see it as a sign of what matters to you. Fear only has power because it's tied to things we care about. Aizawa considered this, a flicker of curiosity sparking in his mind. So you're saying I should accept it? Not exactly, Yamada clarified. I mean, look at it as a reminder of what's important. Fear shows up when we have something to lose, something worth protecting. And you've built a lot that's worth protecting, Shouta. Maybe that's where the strength to face it lies. Aizawa fell silent, letting Yamada's words sink in. He thought of his students, of Yamada, of the life he'd chosen and fought for. The fear wasn't a sign of weakness, but a reflection of the things he valued, the people he wanted to protect, the life he wanted to preserve. In a way, it was a testament to everything he held dear. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity, a new perspective on the fear that had plagued him. He still didn't have all the answers, and he knew the road ahead would be challenging, but the thought that the fear might serve a purpose, that it was tied to his commitment to others, gave him a renewed sense of resolve. They walked for a while longer, the silence comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. When they eventually made their way back inside, Aizawa felt a little lighter, a little more in control. The fear was still there, but it felt different, less overpowering, as though he'd gained a small foothold against it. Back in the hallway, Yamada gave him an encouraging nod. I'll see you later tonight, all right? Aizawa returned the nod, his voice steady. Yeah. Thanks for everything. Yamada gave him a quick, reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. Anytime, Shouta. I'm here for as long as you need. As Yamada walked away, Aizawa felt a sense of quiet confidence settle over him. The fear hadn't vanished, but he now felt more prepared to face it, strengthened by the reminder that he wasn't alone. He'd take it one step at a time, and with Yamada by his side, he felt a renewed hope that he could conquer this darkness. As he headed back to his classroom, Aizawa felt a newfound resolve, a resolve that, no matter how deep the shadows, he could face them. And as he walked through the familiar halls, he held on to that strength, knowing he would keep moving forward, one day at a time. Chapter 5, Facing the Shadows. Aizawa's resolve had grown over the past few days, a quiet but steady strength that guided him forward. He still felt the fear's presence, but with Yamada's perspective echoing in his mind, he'd begun to see it as less of a burden and more as a reminder of what he valued. Fear was no longer an enemy but an uncomfortable ally, something that kept him connected to the people and responsibilities he held close. That morning, he arrived at UA feeling a tentative calm, a confidence that had been missing since the night of the encounter. The familiar halls, the sounds of students preparing for the day, all grounded him. Aizawa took a deep breath, letting the feeling of purpose fill him as he headed toward his classroom. He had barely stepped inside when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Midoriya approaching, his face flushed with excitement and a hint of nerves. Midoriya was holding a stack of papers, his eyes bright with a mix of anticipation and something else, concern, perhaps. "Sensei." Midoriya called out, his voice a little breathless. "I wanted to talk to you about today's training exercise. I thought of a strategy that might work, but I wanted to get your opinion first." Aizawa offered a slight nod, gesturing for Midoriya to continue. "Go on." Midoriya explained his idea with the usual intensity, his hands moving as he spoke, the papers nearly slipping from his grip. Aizawa listened, giving small nods and prompts, his mind fully engaged in the moment. There was something oddly reassuring about Midoriya's passion, a reminder of the reasons he'd become a teacher in the first place. He could feel himself settle, the fear at the edges of his mind momentarily quieted. As Midoriya finished, Aizawa gave a thoughtful nod. "Your strategy is sound, but make sure you stay aware of your surroundings. Don't let tunnel vision blind you to potential risks." Midoriya's face lit up, a smile breaking through his serious expression. "Thank you, Sensei. I'll keep that in mind." Aizawa watched him leave, a faint smile touching his lips. The interaction left him feeling more grounded, his focus sharpened. With the students in mind, he found renewed motivation, a sense that he could confront his own struggles in the same way he guided his students. But as the day continued, Aizawa found himself slipping again. The fear wasn't gone, just pushed aside, waiting for a moment of weakness to resurface. During a break between classes, he felt it creeping back in, an unexplainable chill winding its way through him. The sounds around him grew sharper, the light a little too bright, the shadows a little too dark. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, deep breath, trying to regain control. The familiar techniques helped, but only so much. He knew this wasn't a battle he could win in a single day. It was going to take patience and strength, qualities he'd always expected of others, but was now being forced to summon within himself. Just as the wave of anxiety began to subside, a quiet knock on the door brought him back to the present. He opened his eyes to see Yamada standing in the doorway, a calm, encouraging smile on his face. "Hey," Yamada greeted him softly, stepping inside. "I thought I'd check in. How's everything going?" Aizawa took a steadying breath, meeting Yamada's gaze. "It's better," he admitted, though the word felt fragile, as if the progress could be shattered at any moment. "But it still comes and goes. Sometimes, I think I have a handle on it, and then, it's back." Yamada nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's okay for it to come and go. You're doing something incredibly hard, Shouta, facing something that most people would avoid. But every time you confront it, even a little, you're building strength." Aizawa leaned back, the reassurance settling over him like a comforting weight. He knew Yamada was right, that progress wasn't linear and that healing rarely happened on a set timeline. But it was a lesson he struggled to accept, his instincts always pushing him to maintain control, to never show weakness. I keep thinking that I need to be more, he admitted quietly. Stronger, faster. I've always handled things on my own, but this isn't something I can solve alone. Yamada took a seat across from him, his gaze steady. Strength isn't just about doing things alone. It's about knowing when to lean on others, too. You've always been there for your students, for your friends. Now it's okay to let someone else be there for you. The words struck a chord deep within Aizawa. He'd always been the protector, the one his students and colleagues could rely on, but now he was the one in need. It wasn't a position he was used to, but Yamada's unwavering presence reminded him that he didn't have to carry this burden alone. As if sensing the shift in his thoughts, Yamada stood, extending a hand. Come on. Let's take a walk. Clear the air a bit. Aizawa hesitated, then took Yamada's hand, allowing himself to be led out of the classroom and down the hall. They walked side by side, the quiet rhythm of their steps easing the tension that had coiled inside him. The campus grounds were quiet, students bustling here and there, but the presence of life around him was comforting, a reminder of the purpose he'd dedicated his life to. They walked in silence for a while, Yamada occasionally glancing over, his gaze filled with understanding. Finally, they reached a bench under a tree, where they sat, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in soft patterns. Aizawa closed his eyes, letting the warmth and stillness wash over him. I know this isn't easy, Yamada said softly, breaking the silence. But every step you take, even the small ones, is a victory. You're not alone, Shouta. And this fear, it doesn't define you. It's just a part of your journey. Aizawa opened his eyes, a sense of calm settling over him. Yamada's words echoed in his mind, a steady reminder that he didn't have to be perfect, that he was allowed to struggle, to take things one day at a time. He looked over at Yamada, a rare hint of vulnerability in his gaze. Thank you, Hizashi, he said quietly. For being here, for everything. Yamada's smile was warm, reassuring. Always. That's what partners are for. They sat there for a while longer, the quiet companionship a balm to Aizawa's frayed nerves. The fear was still there, but it felt more manageable, more distant, as though he'd taken a small but significant step forward. With Yamada by his side, he knew he could continue to face it, one day at a time. As they rose to head back, Aizawa felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that the journey might be long, but he didn't have to walk it alone. He could face the shadows, one step at a time, and with Yamada's support, he felt a little closer to reclaiming the peace he'd once known. After their walk, Aizawa and Yamada returned to the classroom building, the familiar surroundings now offering a strange sense of relief. The campus was quieter, with most students focused on their studies or training sessions, leaving the hallways mostly empty. The solitude made it easier for Aizawa to collect his thoughts, a quiet reprieve from the struggle within him. As they approached his classroom door, Yamada hesitated, glancing back at Aizawa. Shouta, he began, his voice gentle, I want you to know that you don't always have to put on a strong front with me. It's okay to let yourself be human. Aizawa looked at him, taken aback by the sincerity in Yamada's gaze. Yamada had always been a source of unwavering support, a calm voice when he needed it most, but hearing him express this so openly struck a deeper chord. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, the vulnerability catching him off guard. It's not easy, Aizawa admitted, his voice low. I've always kept my guard up. Being vulnerable, it feels like giving up control. And control is the one thing I rely on. Yamada nodded, his expression understanding. I know. But sometimes letting go, even just a little, doesn't mean you're losing control. It means you're sharing the weight, allowing someone else to help carry it with you. And that takes strength, too. Aizawa took a deep breath, letting Yamada's words settle over him. The thought of letting someone else shoulder even a fraction of his burden was foreign, but the weight of it all, the constant vigilance, was exhausting. Yamada's offer wasn't just one of comfort, it was a reminder that he didn't have to be alone in his struggle. Maybe you're right, Aizawa said quietly, a rare softness in his tone. I don't know if I can do this on my own anymore. Yamada's hand rested on his shoulder, a reassuring presence. You don't have to. That's why I'm here, Shouta. We're in this together. They stood in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. For once, Aizawa allowed himself to lean into Yamada's presence, accepting the support offered to him without hesitation or resistance. It felt strange, letting his guard down, but it also brought a faint sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted, if only slightly. After a moment, Yamada stepped back, his smile warm and encouraging. Come on. Let's get some fresh air. I think it's time for a change of scenery. They made their way outside once again, crossing the campus grounds to a quieter part of the school, a small garden that many teachers and students used as a retreat from the bustle of the main campus. The garden was a peaceful spot, filled with neatly kept plants and flowers, their vibrant colors contrasting with the calming green of the surrounding foliage. They sat on a bench near the edge of the garden, the sunlight filtering through the trees casting soft patterns on the ground. Aizawa took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle over him. The calm was different here, more pronounced, as though the garden itself had absorbed years of quiet moments, offering a sanctuary from the noise of the outside world. You know, Yamada said, breaking the silence, I come here a lot when I need to clear my head. There's something about being surrounded by nature that just helps put things into perspective. Aizawa glanced around, taking in the serene atmosphere. The quiet, the gentle rustle of leaves, the warmth of the sun, all of it felt grounding, as though the fear couldn't reach him here, as though he were safe. Maybe I should try that more often, he replied, his tone contemplative. I've always preferred solitude, but this feels different. Yamada smiled, a flicker of understanding in his gaze. Solitude has its place, but sometimes, finding peace in the company of someone you trust can make all the difference. You're allowed to find comfort, Shouta. It doesn't make you any less strong. Aizawa looked down, his expression softening. He'd always prided himself on his independence, his resilience, but Yamada's words had a way of breaking down the walls he'd built around himself. For the first time, he allowed himself to see vulnerability not as a weakness, but as a necessary part of healing, a part he'd avoided for too long. As they sat in comfortable silence, Yamada's hand found his, a quiet gesture of support. Aizawa felt the warmth of Yamada's touch, a steadying force that reminded him he wasn't alone. He looked at Yamada, a small smile forming, gratitude clear in his eyes. Thank you, Hizashi, he said softly, the words carrying a weight of their own. For everything. Yamada's smile widened, his grip on Aizawa's hand gentle yet firm. Always, Shouta. That's what I'm here for. They sat together for a while longer, the quiet companionship filling the spaces between them, a silent reassurance that neither had to face their struggles alone. The fear still lingered in the back of Aizawa's mind, but with Yamada beside him, it felt less oppressive, more manageable. The weight of it was still there, but now, it was a weight he didn't have to carry alone. Eventually, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, they rose to leave, Aizawa feeling lighter than he had in days. The walk back to the main building was quiet, the evening air cool and refreshing. As they neared the classrooms, Yamada glanced over, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he began, I think there's real progress here, Shouta. You're not just surviving this, you're finding ways to face it. And that's something to be proud of. Aizawa's gaze softened, the words settling over him like a balm. Maybe you're right, he admitted, a hint of acceptance in his voice. I'm trying. Yamada's hand gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. That's all you need to do. One step at a time. They paused outside Aizawa's classroom, the reality of the day's challenges returning. But instead of the usual apprehension, Aizawa felt a sense of readiness. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Yamada's support, his unwavering presence, had given him a foundation to build on, a strength that extended beyond his own resolve. "Thank you, Hizashi," he said, his voice low but filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't say it enough, but, thank you." Yamada's smile was warm, his eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to say it, Shouta. I already know." With that, Yamada gave him a quick nod and headed down the hall, leaving Aizawa to his thoughts. Aizawa watched him go, a faint smile lingering as he turned back to his classroom. The fear was still there, but it felt different now, a shadow that he could face, a part of himself he could learn to live with. As he stepped back into the classroom, he took a deep breath, a newfound confidence settling over him. The journey was far from over, but with Yamada by his side, he knew he could face it, one step, one moment, at a time. Chapter 6, Testing the Limits. Aizawa had been feeling a subtle shift in himself, a strengthening, however tentative. Each day, he'd managed to face the persistent shadows of his fear with more resilience. Yamada's unwavering support had been his anchor, and his own sense of purpose as a teacher kept him grounded. But today, as he entered UA's main training arena for a joint exercise, he felt a new kind of tension building. The exercise was straightforward, an obstacle course designed to challenge the students' endurance, teamwork, and adaptability. Aizawa would monitor from the sidelines with Yamada and a few other teachers, offering guidance and observing how the students managed the rigorous course. It was something he had done many times before, yet today, the energy in the air felt different. His usual confidence wavered, a prickling sensation creeping along the edges of his mind. As he took his place alongside Yamada, he scanned the students gathering on the field, their excitement contagious. Each of them seemed eager to prove themselves, and seeing their enthusiasm reminded him why he was here. But the dark whispers of doubt began to seep into his thoughts, small tendrils of anxiety winding their way through his usual calm. "You ready?" Yamada asked beside him, his voice light but filled with an undertone of reassurance. Aizawa nodded, meeting Yamada's gaze. "Yes, I'm ready," he replied, keeping his tone steady. Yamada gave him a quick, encouraging smile, and the sight of it brought a brief moment of calm. Aizawa reminded himself of all the progress he had made, the strength he had built, and the purpose he carried. Whatever the day had in store, he could handle it. He wasn't facing this alone. The exercise began, the students moving through the obstacles in groups, tackling various challenges that required coordination and quick thinking. Aizawa watched closely, his focus on assessing their teamwork and problem-solving skills. His attention shifted between the groups, calling out pointers and offering guidance. For a while, the routine kept him anchored, the familiar rhythm of teaching steadying his nerves. But halfway through the exercise, something shifted. A loud crash sounded from the far end of the arena, followed by a student's startled shout. Aizawa's senses went on high alert, his gaze snapping to the source of the noise. One of the students, Kirishima, was struggling with a piece of equipment that had toppled over, trapping his leg beneath it. The other students nearby quickly moved to help, but the sight of Kirishima pinned down triggered something deep within Aizawa, an unexpected surge of fear that hit him like a wave. His breath caught, his pulse spiking as his mind raced, his vision blurring slightly around the edges. The rational part of him knew that Kirishima was in no real danger, the equipment was cushioned and designed to be safe for training. But the fear latched onto his thoughts, warping them, making the scene appear more perilous than it was. He felt a hand on his arm, grounding him. Yamada was beside him, his voice calm and steady. "It's all right, Shouta. Look, they're helping him. He's going to be fine." Aizawa forced himself to breathe, focusing on Yamada's voice, letting it cut through the fog of anxiety clouding his mind. He watched as Midoriya and Ida worked together to lift the equipment, freeing Kirishima, who stood up with an embarrassed grin, brushing off the incident with his usual resilience. The students resumed their tasks, the incident already forgotten by everyone, except Aizawa. He clenched his fists, frustration simmering beneath the surface. He'd been doing so well, had been making progress, yet here he was, struggling to contain the fear that had resurfaced so suddenly. The feeling of vulnerability was maddening, the sense of weakness gnawing at his resolve. Yamada stayed close, sensing the internal battle raging within him. He leaned in, his voice low and reassuring. Shouta, remember, it's okay to feel this. You're not failing just because you're afraid. It's part of the process. Aizawa took a deep breath, forcing himself to relax, to let go of the expectation that he had to be in control at every moment. Yamada's words, simple as they were, helped him regain a sliver of calm. The fear was still there, lingering, but he felt more capable of handling it, of letting it exist without letting it dictate his actions. They continued observing the students, Aizawa gradually regaining his focus as the exercise progressed. The fear still pulsed beneath the surface, a reminder of his vulnerability, but he reminded himself that it didn't define him. He was still here, still guiding his students, still holding himself steady, even if it didn't feel perfect. Toward the end of the exercise, he found himself beside Midoriya, who was reviewing his group's progress with enthusiasm. Midoriya looked up, his eyes bright with admiration. "Sensei, this exercise was incredible. I learned so much about teamwork and focus." Aizawa managed a faint smile, the pride in Midoriya's gaze a balm to his own uncertainty. "You did well, Midoriya. Remember, it's about adapting to the situation, no matter how challenging." Midoriya nodded, his determination evident. "I'll keep that in mind, Sensei. Thank you for always pushing us to be better." As Midoriya moved on to join his classmates, Aizawa felt a flicker of reassurance. He had been so focused on his own struggle that he hadn't fully realized the impact he was still making. Even amidst his own fear, he was guiding these students, shaping their growth, instilling resilience in them, a resilience that, in turn, reminded him of his own. When the exercise concluded, the students filed out, energized and chatting amongst themselves about the challenges they'd faced. Aizawa watched them go, the weight of the day settling over him, but this time, it felt different. The fear hadn't won. He'd faced it, even if imperfectly, and had still managed to fulfill his role as their teacher. Yamada came to stand beside him, a look of pride in his eyes. "You did it, Shouta. You faced it." Aizawa looked over, his gaze steady. "It didn't feel easy. I nearly lost control." Yamada shook his head, his voice gentle, but firm. "But you didn't. You stayed, you faced it, and you didn't let it hold you back. That's more than enough." Aizawa let out a slow breath, a sense of quiet acceptance settling over him. The journey was far from over, but this moment, however small, felt like a victory. He had faced the shadows, had let the fear exist without letting it consume him, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of confidence in his ability to keep moving forward. "Thank you, Hizashi," he said quietly, his gratitude clear. "For everything." Yamada smiled, his hand resting on Aizawa's shoulder. "Always, Shouta. Remember, you're stronger than you know." As they stood together in the fading light, Aizawa felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to keep fighting, to keep growing. The fear would still be there, but now, he was ready to face it, one moment, one step at a time. The day's training session had taken a toll, and by the time the students left the arena, Aizawa felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He knew he'd made progress, yet there was a lingering weight, a reminder that his journey wasn't over. Despite the victories, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was still only halfway through this struggle. Yamada stayed beside him as they watched the students disperse. The arena was nearly empty now, the hum of activity fading, leaving a calm quiet. Aizawa took a steady breath, aware of Yamada's patient gaze. "You handled today well, Shouta," Yamada said, his voice warm. "You faced the fear, even when it tried to push you under. That's strength." Aizawa nodded, absorbing the words, but still feeling the residual effects of the day. it didn't feel strong. I was holding on by a thread at one point. Yamada's gaze softened, his hand resting on Aizawa's shoulder. Strength isn't about feeling invincible. It's about finding the courage to keep going, even when you're barely holding on. And you did that. You stayed present, you helped your students, and you didn't let the fear control you. Aizawa looked away, a flicker of gratitude stirring within him. Yamada's words were grounding, a steady force that kept him connected to the progress he'd made, even when doubt threatened to creep in. For so long, he'd seen himself as the pillar others relied on, he hadn't known how to let anyone else be that for him. I don't know what I'd do without you, Aizawa admitted, the words quiet but filled with sincerity. It was an admission that he didn't often make, but one that felt important in this moment. You've been here every step of the way. Yamada's smile was gentle, his gaze filled with understanding. That's what we do, Shouta. We're in this together. You've been my rock more times than I can count. It's my turn to be yours. They lingered in the quiet of the empty arena, an unspoken bond filling the space between them. Aizawa let himself feel the support, the solidarity, allowing the vulnerability he'd kept at bay to settle over him without resistance. In the silence, he realized something he hadn't acknowledged before. The fear was losing its power over him, not because it had disappeared, but because he was learning to let go of the need to control it entirely. Yamada's hand gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. You ready to head out? Aizawa nodded, letting out a slow breath. Yeah. I think I am. They walked together through the hallways of UA, the silence between them comfortable, filled with an understanding that didn't require words. As they neared the exit, Aizawa felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the journey he was on, no longer feeling the need to rush to the end. When they reached the doors, Yamada stopped, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Shouta, do you mind if I make a suggestion? Aizawa looked at him, curious. Go ahead. There's a place I'd like to take you, Yamada said, his voice soft, but filled with intent. It's nothing flashy, just a spot I found years ago that helps me clear my head. I think it might help you, too. Aizawa hesitated, the thought of trying something new unsettling, but Yamada's sincerity reassured him. All right, he agreed, trusting that Yamada knew what he needed. They left the school grounds and drove in comfortable silence. Yamada led him through winding streets, eventually parking near a secluded park on the outskirts of the city. The area was quiet, the trees tall and dense, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the noise and light from the city. It was peaceful, removed from the distractions of everyday life. Yamada led Aizawa down a narrow path, guiding him deeper into the park until they reached a small clearing. At its center stood a lone bench, positioned to overlook a tranquil lake. The water was still, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun, casting a warm, amber light over everything. Aizawa took in the scene, a sense of calm washing over him. The setting was simple, but it had a beauty that resonated with him, a quiet strength in its simplicity. This is where I come when I need to find peace, Yamada said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whenever things get overwhelming, I come here to remind myself of the things that matter, the things that ground me. I thought it might do the same for you. Aizawa sank onto the bench, his gaze fixed on the water. He let the silence settle over him, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly as he focused on the gentle movement of the lake. The stillness was comforting, a reminder that he didn't always have to be in motion, that he could find strength in moments of rest. Yamada sat beside him, his presence a steady anchor. They didn't speak, but the quiet between them was filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared respect for the journey each had walked. Aizawa closed his eyes, letting himself relax, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over him. In the quiet, he felt the fear that had clung to him loosen its hold, as though the stillness of the lake mirrored the calm within him. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to fight or resist it. He let it exist, acknowledging its presence, without letting it dictate his actions. He could feel it there, but it no longer held the same power. After a while, Yamada spoke, his voice gentle. Shouta, you've come so far. I've watched you face this fear head-on, day after day, and you've grown stronger because of it. I'm proud of you. Aizawa opened his eyes, the gratitude he felt overwhelming. He looked at Yamada, the vulnerability clear in his gaze. Thank you, Hizashi. For everything. I don't think I'd be here without you. Yamada's smile was soft, his gaze filled with warmth. You would have found your way, Shouta. I just helped remind you of the strength you already had. They sat together, the lake reflecting the fading light, a quiet reminder of the progress Aizawa had made. He didn't know if he would ever be free of the fear entirely, but he knew now that he had the resilience to face it, to live with it, and to move forward despite it. As they rose to leave, Aizawa took one last look at the lake, a newfound peace settling over him. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing he wasn't alone. As they walked back to the car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that strength wasn't about being unbreakable, it was about finding the courage to keep moving, no matter how many times you had to rebuild. And with Yamada by his side, Aizawa knew he had all the strength he needed. Chapter 7, Embracing the Shadows. The days following their trip to the lake were calmer, the lingering sense of fear that had haunted Aizawa now feeling more like a whisper than a roar. He still felt it at times, a flicker of tension, a shadow at the edge of his mind, but he no longer allowed it to define his actions or overshadow his purpose. It was there, but he had learned to coexist with it, a quiet reminder of his journey and his resilience. This morning, as he made his way to the classroom, Aizawa felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense of quiet confidence he hadn't felt in months. The students had been preparing for their final practical exam of the semester, a challenge he'd designed to test both their technical skills and their mental endurance. As he stepped into the classroom, the students greeted him with their usual energy, their excitement palpable. Good morning, Sensei. Uraraka called out, her cheerful voice echoing through the room. The rest of the class echoed her, their voices filled with enthusiasm and respect. Aizawa nodded in acknowledgement, a small smile forming as he took his place at the front of the room. Good morning. I hope you're all ready to face today's challenge. The students exchanged glances, the mixture of anticipation and nerves evident in their expressions. Aizawa had purposely kept the details of the exam vague, knowing that a degree of unpredictability would test their adaptability, a crucial skill for any hero. Today's exercise is designed to push you out of your comfort zones, Aizawa began, his voice steady and calm. You'll be facing obstacles that require not just physical skill, but mental focus. Your goal is to keep moving forward, no matter what. As he spoke, he saw the determination in their eyes, the silent promises they made to themselves to give their best effort. It was a look he'd seen countless times, one that reminded him of the strength within each of them. And as he looked around the room, he felt a new kind of pride, a pride not only in them but in himself, for being able to stand here without being consumed by his own shadows. Remember, he continued, his gaze steady, it's not about perfection. It's about resilience and focus. No matter what you face, keep moving forward. The students nodded, taking in his words with a seriousness that showed their respect and trust in him. With a final nod, he led them out to the training field, Yamada joining them with an encouraging grin. As the exercise began, Aizawa watched his students navigate the various obstacles, his focus on assessing not only their physical abilities, but their determination and teamwork. Some stumbled, some hesitated, but each of them kept pushing forward, drawing on the lessons they'd learned over the semester. He felt a quiet pride, seeing them face their own challenges, reminded of his own journey. But halfway through the exercise, an unexpected incident occurred. One of the students, Tokoyami, miscalculated a jump and landed awkwardly, twisting his ankle. He gritted his teeth, trying to stand, but the pain was evident. The other students noticed, hesitating as they glanced between Aizawa and Tokoyami, unsure of whether to intervene. Aizawa's instinct was to move, to step in and help, but he stopped himself, recognizing the importance of letting them handle the situation. He observed as Midoriya approached Tokoyami, offering him support, his voice calm and encouraging. The rest of the class rallied around, offering their assistance without hesitation, adapting to the situation with a level of maturity and resilience that made Aizawa's chest swell with pride. He exchanged a glance with Yamada, who gave him an approving nod. "Looks like they're learning from the best," Yamada murmured, his voice filled with admiration. Aizawa's lips curved into a small smile. He knew that the journey he'd been on, the struggle he'd faced, had shaped the way he guided his students, instilling in them the importance of resilience and trust. The fear that had once felt overwhelming was now something he could look back on as a lesson, a challenge that had ultimately strengthened him. As the exercise continued, Aizawa felt a quiet peace settle over him. The shadows were still there, but they no longer held power over him. Instead, they had become a part of his story, a testament to his strength and growth. He realized now that facing his fear wasn't about eliminating it, but about finding a way to live with it, to let it shape him without consuming him. When the exercise finally concluded, he gathered the students together, offering feedback and acknowledging their strengths. They listened intently, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and pride, a reflection of the effort they had put in. Aizawa spoke with calm confidence, feeling a deep connection to the words he shared, a connection born not only from his role as their teacher but from his own journey of facing fear and uncertainty. "Today, you all demonstrated what it means to be resilient," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "You faced challenges, adapted, and supported each other. That's what makes a hero, not just the ability to overcome obstacles, but the willingness to keep going, even when it's hard." The students looked at him with admiration, their respect evident. And as he met their gaze, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he'd chosen this path, and the impact he could have on those who followed in his footsteps. Yamada approached as the students filed out, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You know, Shouta, I think today's exercise wasn't just a lesson for them. It was a reminder of how far you've come, too." Aizawa considered this, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe. I think I needed to face this, to see that the fear doesn't have to define me." Yamada placed a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring presence. "And it doesn't. You've taken control, found your way through it. That's something to be proud of." Aizawa nodded, a quiet acceptance settling over him. The fear would always be there in some form, but he had learned to coexist with it, to let it be a part of him without letting it control him. And in doing so, he discovered a new strength, a resilience that went beyond physical endurance or skill. It was a strength rooted in vulnerability, in the willingness to face the unknown, to trust those around him, and to keep moving forward. As he walked back to the school alongside Yamada, Aizawa felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but he had emerged stronger, more connected to himself and to those who mattered most. He knew now that he didn't have to be perfect, that strength was not the absence of fear but the courage to face it, to live with it, and to find meaning in the struggle. With Yamada by his side, Aizawa felt ready to face whatever came next. The shadows would always be a part of him, but they no longer defined him. He was, above all else, resilient. The evening was quiet as Aizawa and Yamada returned to their shared home. The day's events lingered in Aizawa's mind, a mixture of pride, peace, and a feeling he hadn't fully grasped yet, but one that felt like resolution. After months of wrestling with fear and uncertainty, he felt a sense of calm that went deeper than anything he'd experienced in a long time. Yamada settled into the kitchen, pouring tea for both of them, a small ritual that had become a comfort after long days. Aizawa joined him at the table, wrapping his hands around the warm cup, letting the quiet envelop them. The silence between them was filled with understanding, a shared appreciation of the journey they had walked together. After a few moments, Yamada spoke, his voice soft. "How are you feeling, Shouta?" Aizawa considered the question, searching for the right words. Different, he finally said, his voice thoughtful. It's hard to explain, but I don't feel weighed down by it anymore. The fear, it's still there, but it doesn't control me. It feels like I've made peace with it. Yamada's gaze softened, his smile warm. That's what you've been working toward, isn't it? Finding a way to live with it, to keep going even when it's hard. Aizawa nodded, letting Yamada's words settle over him. I thought facing fear meant conquering it, pushing it away. But I've realized now that it's more about acceptance. Letting it be there without letting it define me. They sipped their tea in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Aizawa, the realization felt profound, a shift in how he saw himself, in how he approached his own limitations. He had always believed strength meant being unbreakable, but this journey had shown him that true strength lay in resilience, in the willingness to keep moving forward, even when every step felt uncertain. Thank you, Hizashi, he said after a moment, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. I don't think I could have gotten here without you. Yamada's smile widened, his gaze warm and understanding. You would have found your way, Shouta. I just reminded you of what you already had inside. Aizawa's lips curved into a small smile, appreciating the sentiment. Yamada had been right, throughout this journey, he had discovered a strength within himself he hadn't realized was there. The fear had once seemed insurmountable, an enemy he could never conquer. But now, it was simply a part of him, something he could acknowledge without shame. They finished their tea, the comforting warmth spreading through him as they sat together, enjoying the peace of the evening. The sense of resolution settled over Aizawa, bringing with it a profound clarity. He'd found his way back to himself, not by fighting against his fear but by learning to coexist with it, by accepting it as part of his own story. Eventually, Yamada broke the silence, his tone light. You know, there's something really beautiful about all of this. You faced something that was deeply personal, something most people would run from. And here you are, stronger because of it. Aizawa looked at him, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's what being a hero really means, he said, his voice soft. It's not about being fearless. It's about finding the courage to keep going, even when you're afraid. Yamada's eyes sparkled with pride. Exactly. And I think your students see that in you. You've taught them more than just techniques and skills, Shouta. You've shown them what it means to be resilient. Aizawa felt a swell of pride, not just in himself, but in his students. He'd always believed in leading by example, in showing them that being a hero wasn't just about strength, but about character, resilience, and heart. This journey, as difficult as it had been, had given him a deeper understanding of what he wanted to impart to his students, a lesson on courage, on embracing vulnerability, and on finding strength in the struggle. As the night deepened, Aizawa felt a quiet sense of peace, a feeling that went beyond simple relief. It was a sense of wholeness, of having reclaimed a part of himself he hadn't realized he'd lost. He looked at Yamada, his voice soft, but filled with conviction. I think I'm ready, he said, the words carrying a finality that felt both comforting and empowering. Ready to move forward. Yamada's smile was gentle, filled with understanding. I knew you would be. You've come so far, Shouta. And I'll be here, wherever this journey takes you. They sat in comfortable silence, the quiet companionship filling the space with an unspoken bond. Aizawa knew now that he didn't have to face his challenges alone, that strength wasn't about doing everything himself. It was about trusting those around him, allowing himself to be vulnerable, and knowing that he had people who would stand by him, no matter what. The fear would always be a part of him, a shadow that lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a reminder of his own resilience, a testament to the strength he'd found within himself and the support he'd embraced from those he cared about. As the clock ticked on, Yamada's hand found his, a simple gesture that held a world of meaning. Aizawa squeezed it gently, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had walked together. And as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth and understanding of someone who truly knew him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the journey, for the struggle, and for the strength he had discovered within himself. When he finally rose to leave, he felt lighter, as though a weight he'd been carrying for far too long had finally lifted. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them, armed not only with his own strength but with the support of those who stood beside him. As he looked out into the quiet night, he knew that he was not alone, that he was part of something greater, a network of trust, resilience, and love that would carry him forward, no matter what came next. For the first time in a long time, Aizawa felt whole, ready to embrace the future, shadows and all. This is the end of Shadows of Fear, by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you liked it. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day, angels.